So the first thing that we discussed very quickly by Rabbi Daniel Brody is that there was a quick recap, because this year Erev Pesach is on Shabbos. So we learned that the check-in this year is pushed back to Thursday night, and the burning and getting rid of chometz is on a Friday morning this year by midday. Okay. One also nullifies, in other words, you disown by saying the declaration on Thursday night. When you do Berikat mates, you have to do a check, and you do a second disowning on Shabbos morning too. But obviously, the disowning is more of a statement as opposed to on the Friday where you actually burn the chometz and make a statement there. You also sell the chometz before Shabbos, that goes without saying. So your whole house has to be chometz free by Friday morning. So the question is, well, what do you eat over Shabbos? So Shabbos meals challah. So the fact of it is the Friday night supper and Shabbos morning meal, on every Shabbos and Yom Tov, you need to make it on two breads, a lechem Mishna, a double portion. So this Shabbos is no different. So you must make and probably buy at least 2 challahs or rows for each meal, and preferably pittas, which don't crumble as much as challah. Store them in a safe place and separate them. Don't let them make your house become chometzdik. Keep in mind that Shabbos is Erev Pesach, and one may not eat this after the 4th hour after sunrise at about 10 a.m. One must get rid of all chometz by the 5th hour, 11 a.m. It's best if one can eat their meal outside or on the porch in the garden, so there's less likelihood of any crumbs coming into the house, where all Pesach meals will be. If you can't, it's fine, but just be very vigilant for challah and pitta to be under your control. Make kiddush and go wash natilat yadayim and make hamotzi and breads and eat them. On Friday night you can eat challah and pitta the whole night, but on Shabbos morning you must be done by around 10 a.m. Obviously there is people generally do not eat matzah the day before, unless you're Sephardi, because even Sephardim have matzah during the year. So that would probably be a little bit more safe, but you're not allowed to do it. The leftover challah pitta must be gathered and thrown away or given to non-Jews as a gift, or flushed down the toilet by 11 a.m. In addition, one must again nullify by declaration of disowning the chometz the concern that one has mistakenly left some chometz around and didn't throw it out. If you have crumbs on the tablecloth, you should shake it away, preferably get a non-Jew to sweep it up. And if there isn't a non-Jew, you can do it as long as it's a tiled carpet, sand floor. So I'm not going to go through all the other aspects. All I'm saying is, guys, I would suggest that if that's the case, that you eat the meal outside. That's option 1. Or option 2, go to somebody for Shabbos and let it be their problem.
Yeah. But you know what you can do? You can use egg matzah instead of challah and pitta. Just makes Simon life so much the lights. Lighting candles in the layman's terms. Okay, the Midrash indicates that the Jewish people kindled Sabbath lights during the period that they sojourned during the desert. Although the rule is regarded as rabbinical, there are sources which explain that it was instructed by Moshe at Mount Sinai. Reasons for the mitzvah are to honor the day, to create an atmosphere of oneg, and to ensure that the room is lit, and that someone may not stumble and unsettle the tranquility of the household. This mitzvah is very important, so important that a poor person must even appeal for funds in order to perform it. The only other such precepts are the 4 cups of wine on Pesach, the Seder, and the Chanukah light, both of which publicize a miracle. A person who treats the mitzvah Shabbos lights conscientiously will be amply rewarded. The mitzvah applies both to men and women, but is preferably carried out by the woman who performs the mitzvah on everyone's behalf. The Midrash writes that the woman extinguished the light of the world by partaking of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. She compensates for this by restoring the light on Shabbos Eve. It is appropriate for the man to take an active part in the mitzvah, for example, by preparing the candlesticks, since he also withdrew light from the world in the sin of the golden calf. The lights are kindled in the room where the meal is to be served. Candles are normally used, but olive oil is ideal. The minimum requisite number of lights is 1, but the practice is to kindle 2 lights, like what we do, 2 candles, to represent the expression of Shamor and Zachor. In some homes, a light is kindled for each child. Others observe the custom of kindling 7 lights, like the menorah of the temple, or for each day of the week. Some kindle 10 lights, corresponding to the number of commandments on the 2 tablets of the law. In some families, unmarried daughters also kindle a light. This goes on for a while, so let's leave it at that.
All right. We're starting a new Mishna. I'm going to share the screen. Okay, just give me 1 sec, guys. Okay, now, Gavin, can you read it?
Sure. If one chops wood in the public domain and thereby does damage in the private domain of someone else, or if he chops wood in the private domain that is his own and does damage in the public domain, or if he chops wood in the private domain that is his own and does damage in a different private domain which belongs to someone else, he's liable to pay for damage.
Excellent and well read. So we have 3 scenarios. You're chopping wood in the public domain and a shard or splinter or some sort of debris comes and injures somebody else in their own house and they're minding their own business. That's case number 1. Case number 2 is you minding your own business in your workshop, in your garage, and then some debris or some shard leaves your premises and claps somebody that's walking past your house because it flew over the wall. That's case number 2. Case number 3, you working in your own garage and a shard of steel comes off whatever you're doing and clips your neighbor in the head and he lands up in Linksfield Netcare Hospital. That's the 3rd case. And it says in all these cases, all these 3, you're liable for damage. All right. Now, it would seem on superficial basis that would seem obvious, but it's not as obvious as you think, and we're going to go through it now just to get a sense of what we're dealing with here. So we are on 32b1. So the Gemara explains why you have to state all 3 cases explicitly. All right? Let me just adjust my seat a little bit. The light should be a bit better now. All right. So, and why was it necessary for the Tana to state all 3 cases? For if he had stated only the case of one who chops wood in the private domain, that is his, and does damage in the public domain, I might have thought that in that case, it's because the chopper is liable for the damage because many people are found in the public domain. Okay? So what it's saying is as follows, is that the chopper should have considered that there is a huge possibility that in that particular case, if you're chopping wood in the public domain, you've got no right to do any sort of constructive work in the public domain. And the likelihood is that somebody is going to do damage because they're passerbys all the time. You're not allowed to do construction in the public domain. So I might have thought that's why I'm liable for the damage, because many people are found in the public domain. Where the projectile flies from the public domain to the private domain of someone else, where many people are not commonly found, I would say that he's not liable. So the first case is teaching me, again, if one chops wood in the public domain and thereby does damage in the private domain of someone else, he's liable to pay for the damage. So you'd say, fine, that makes sense, because in the public domain, you can't start to do constructional work. There are people walking by. But if a shot happens to hit somebody in the private domain, I need to be told this because it's unlikely that I think anybody would be there at that particular time. Fine. So if I'd stated only the case where the projectile flies from the public domain to the private domain of someone else, I might have thought that only in the case that the chopper is liable for damage, because from the very start he is acting without permission. So what we are saying is this, is that you don't have permission to actually do any sort of constructional work or handy repairs in the public domain because many people could be injured. Okay? So, Gav, can you reiterate these two cases, or Kevin?
Kevin, go for it, otherwise I can.
I'll try. So if somebody does work in the public domain and a shard gets dislodged and injures someone, he's liable. If he does work in a private domain and the shard flies into the public domain, but also because I read over it, he's liable in every case. Public to private, public within public, and private to public, and public to private.
That's correct. What I'm saying is as follows, is that, listen, what I'm saying is that what is the reason? Let's just take the first case. If you take the case, if one chops wood in the public domain and thereby does damage in the private domain of someone else, what's the reason I would say that they are responsible?
Because they must be responsible, because it's risky and you've got to be vigilant. Doesn't matter where you are.
No, I understand that, but what I'm saying is why?
I don't know. Because people can get injured.
Okay, no, but I'm saying what I'm trying to look for is that I want you to give me the specific logical reasons in each case, in a public domain and in a private domain, and what we learn from those three cases.
Public domain is lots of people there.
Correct. Therefore?
So you have to be even more careful, even more vigilant.
Correct. The statistical probability of hurting somebody is greater the more people that are in the vicinity of you working with products that have, if you're doing angle grinding and there's sparks that are flying or you're chopping things, more people are likely to get injured the more people there are near where you're working. That's absolutely correct, Kevin. And in a private domain?
There's still people around.
No, why can't I work in my own yard?
Or you must just secure the walls and the exit points so that shards and materials don't fly out and potentially injure someone.
Okay.
No, that's a good one. It's a bit more complicated.
Fair
But you're entitled to do work in your own private domain. Why should
Okay.
Should be less restrictions compared to work in a public domain.
Correct. So the thing of it is that's exactly the point. That's why we have to learn these three principles. I'm gonna talk it out clearly, and we're gonna go step by step. But the one reason that we can say very clearly is that I would have thought that I have permission to work in my own premises. So what's the problem there? So why is it liability? Okay, that's the question that comes to mind.
You would think it's unintentional, because how's he supposed to know? I'm just saying you would think that.
You would think that, absolutely. Absolutely.
Unless he's on the absolute border. I mean, if he's got a massive property and he's working right next to the fence, it's got a whole thing that's like doing cutting wood, whatever he's doing, there's obviously a risk that it could go over the wall. But if he's got a small premises, it's difficult for him. That's
like a workshop.
Yeah, and in any case, if it's your own premises, why not? So let's go through this piece by piece. The Mishna's got three cases. Let's study the order. First order, if one chops wood in the public domain and thereby does damage in the private domain of somebody else, or if he chops wood in the private domain that is his own and does damage in the public domain, or if one chops wood in the private domain that is his own and does damage in a different private domain belonging to somebody else, he's liable for the damage. So let's just examine the three cases. Why was it necessary for the Tana to state all three cases? Because if the Tana had only stated the case of one who chops wood in the private domain that is his and does damage in the public domain, I might have thought that only in this case the chopper is liable for the damage, because many people are commonly found in the public domain. But where the projectile flies from the public domain to the private domain of somebody else, where many people are not commonly found, I would say that is not liable. So what we're saying is, let me just read on, and then I'll explain. And if he stated only the case where the projectile flies from the public domain to the private domain of someone else, I might have thought that in that case the chopper is liable for damage because from the very start he is acting without permission. But where the projectile flies from his private domain to the public domain, in which case he is acting with permission, I'd say he's not liable, exactly what Gavin and Kevin were saying. And if I'd only stated these two cases, I would have thought that in these two cases he is liable, in other words, from private domain to the public, because many people are commonly found in the public domain, and therefore if what you did injures in the public domain, you should take into account that your stuff could fall in the public domain. And in the second case, from the public domain to the private domain, because it is without permission that he chops wood there altogether. So the reason why we obligate in the public domain is you've got no business working where there are people there. But where the projectile flies from the private domain that is yours to a different private domain to belonging to somebody else, in which case the injury occurs in a place where many people are not commonly found, and from the start you act with permission because it's your own place, I would say definitely that he's not liable. Therefore, it was necessary for the Tana to teach all these three cases, since the first one or two alone would not have been sufficient. So what we're saying is, guys, is as follows, is that we could work out that somebody would be liable, because if you're doing an activity, even in your own home where you have permission to do that activity, but there could be a risk where debris or some sort of material could fly into the public domain, you could see that there would be a sense of liability, because you can only do activities in your home that do not disturb the neighbors, both on a noise level and on a danger point level. We could even say that initially, if you work in the public domain, that even though it's unlikely that your piece of wood that came off your axe handle would injure a neighbor in this private domain, because not everybody is home, there are not a lot of people there, and it's unlikely to be injured, you're still liable, because in the public domain, even if it never traveled that far, you're very likely to injure somebody. So you don't have permission to work there. But we would never have deduced a case where you minding your own business, working in your workshop at home, you're away from the public domain, and your neighbor happens to be home at 12 o'clock that day, when he generally works a full day, and he came home early because he was sick. You'd say, well, why am I liable? Because it's unlikely anybody would be at the neighbor's place, because he's never home, and I'm entitled to work from my backyard. So there we're saying that the Tana had to mention this case because you could never have deduced it from logic without a halachic ruling. That's all we're saying. All right, guys, does that make sense? Very straightforward, nothing complicated. Gavin, Kevin?
Yeah.
Halachic ruling. Just say this or this way. What about the halachic ruling?
Okay, so sometimes we're given halachic rulings because you can't come by it by logic. Logic would tell Logic would tell you that you can't work in a public domain, because if there are many people passing by and you're busy cutting steel there, and somebody wasn't wearing safety goggles, that probably a shard of steel could go in their eye because of the amount of traffic. You've got no permission to work in the public domain. There's no permission. Fine. Then in your private domain, why would you say that a person is liable if he injures when one of your articles go in the public domain? Because if you're doing any sort of activity, industrial arts activity, where debris can fly into the public, you know there are people there, and therefore you're liable. That's logic. So both these cases are logic, is that the public thoroughfare is for people to walk, not for private people to do construction there. That's logic. Logic number two, you can't do anything in your home where some sort of debris would fly into a public domain if you were near. Say, for example, you had your home above the shops. In the old days, people used to live above the shops, and you were busy cutting wood or cutting steel, and there are people below, where things could fly off and land and tonk somebody on the head. In that case, if somebody was injured, you can't work there because you've got to assume that your debris is going to injure the populace. There are people walking all the time. That's logic, Kevin. What we're not able to deduce by logic, just in quick summary, is if you mind in your own business working at home, there's no shops around you, there's no public domain, and you've got a little farm area or farm holding, and your neighbor is at work all the time, and you happen to do work during the day because you work from home, and he comes home sick one day early, and he gets injured by a shrapnel of something that you're working on that hits him on the head next door, you would say, well, it's an unavoidable accident. It's unlikely he was home. Why am I liable? So the Tana is here in the Mishnah to teach you whether or not it's likely or not, you're liable in such a case, from private domain yours to injuring somebody else in their private domain. Kev, are you awake? Okay, let's go on. All right. So now we're dealing with a new part of the case quickly. The Gemara cites a brisa which discusses the liability of one who inadvertently injures a person who enters his domain. Okay, so the rabbis taught in a brisa, if one enters the shop of a carpenter without permission, and a chip of wood flies off and strikes him in the face and he dies, the carpenter is not liable to exile. But if that person had entered with permission, the carpenter is liable to exile. Okay, it just says the carpenter is liable, but we don't know at this point if he's liable to exile or not. Does that make sense? All right.
Go ahead.
All right. We talk about two cases. The first case is a potential customer enters the shop of a carpenter, okay, and he doesn't have permission to do so. And therefore, if a piece of wood claps him and injures him on the head, obviously the shop owner, the carpenter, is not liable. If it kills him, he's not liable to exile. Okay? So the obvious case is, well, if he's not even aware he's in the shop because he never gave permission, obviously he's not liable to exile because it was the onus was on the customer not to enter a shop without permission. That's obvious. Rashi is saying something more subtle, which you understood, but you didn't understand the second part. First part is he said the carpenter was aware that somebody entered the shop, but even though he was aware, he never gave permission. And you would have thought then that that awareness must have been enough to have made him liable for exile, but apparently not if he did not give permission for the client to enter his shop. Okay? What we're saying here is if he did give permission now for the client to enter his shop and he carried on working on that dangerous equipment, when he gave permission and was aware, in that particular case, we say is liable. What does this liability mean? Does it mean for exile, or does it mean just for injury, or does it mean for perhaps that he gets the death penalty because he's actually given permission? It's almost like a homicide. So we say if he injures the person that he said could come into a shop with permission because he still carried on working on his dangerous equipment, he's liable to pay 4 things for injury. What are those 4 things, Gavin?
4 things for injury.
Yeah.
He's got to pay. He's got to pay for obviously for the injuries, the pain. He's got to pay for what's it called? Recovery.
Yes.
Recuperation. He's got to pay for obviously loss of income. That he's got to pay for loss of income that he would have earned. The difference between what he would have earned and what he can earn now due to whatever injury he's picked up. And he's got to pay. So compassion. He's got to pay compassionate as well.
What's compassionate?
Not compassionate. Not compassionate.
Psychological.
Isn't it pain?
Yes.
Pain and suffering.
Suffering.
Pain, that's right. And humiliation.
No. Okay,
No,
let's explain why. Gav, you only pay for humiliation if you intend to injure somebody. So, for example, in a bar fight, when one person injures his fellow, he's intending to do grievous bodily harm. In that case, if you humiliate somebody in front of others, when your intent was to injure them or beat them up, you pay humiliation. You don't pay humiliation if your intent was not to injure. Might be negligence. Now, let's discuss a point you brought up about paying for compensation of what they would have earned compared to what they earn now. There's two distinct types of employment compensation. The first one goes again on nezek shalem, which means complete payment for injury, okay, which is different to medical payment. So you've got nezek shalem, which is full payment. You've got pain, sar. You've got refuah, medical bills, and you've got shevet, which is convalescing recovery. So, in the nezek shalom, in the actual damages, if you were a surgeon, for example, and now you've got the claw because you were injured and you can't perform surgery, that difference of what you would have earned in your previous expert state as an employee, not in your own business, working for somebody in that capacity, compared to what you're doing now where you can barely lift a fork, to what you that difference you paid in nezek shalom, the actual damage. The convalescing damage, meaning that now you're only capable of watching a vegetable patch that rabbits don't eat from there because you can't use your claws in surgery. In that particular case, it's sort of funny. In that particular case, you paid for the person's convalescing, mean the shevet, means he's so injured now he can't even do that basic sort of menial work, and you pay him for that recuperation time. That's in the shevet, in the recovery phase. But you of what he would have earned watching vegetable patches in his new role. Are you with me? They're two separate forms of employment payment.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? You don't pay for humiliation in this particular. So you pay those four things because whenever man injures man, it's not if man's property ox injures man, because you then are only liable for nezek shalem, or if it's a keren tam for half payments from the body of the animal. But and according to some opinion, you still pay for a man full payment if it injures a man, and not if it injures another animal. That's a separate discussion. But for man injuring a man, you certainly pay those four things. That's if it injures, right? Now, what happens if it kills the man? What happens then? Are you liable to the death penalty? Are you liable to exile or not? Because it says, but he's not liable to exile if the victim dies, because the situation is not comparable to the Torah's prototype of a forest. What are we talking about, this prototype of a forest? I'm going to share my screen to show you. All right? So in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 5. Let me share my screen. All right. So, if you said, for instance, a man goes with his neighbor into the grove to cut wood. At his hand swings the axe to cut down a tree. The axe head flies off the handle and strikes the other, so he dies. The man shall flee to one of these cities and lives. So unfortunately, the Sefaria doesn't seem to explain it exactly right. So the prototype of a forest is as follows, right? Is that I'm entitled to walk in a forest. In other words, in the Torah's case of a forest, this one enters his own domain and this one enters his own domain. And the forest doesn't belong to one person, Gavin. It's not my domain or your domain. It's not your domain as the victim, and it's not the other person's domain as the murderer, for example. It's public territory where they both can walk. So therefore, it's neither the domain of this one or that one. So he's saying this particular case isn't the same. Why? Because this person owns, Shimon owns he's a carpenter, he owns the shop. Reuven came in with the permission of Shimon, and Shimon continued to work on his dangerous equipment and killed Reuven. So in that particular case, he's not liable to exile because it's still his premises. And even though he gave permission, it's not analogous to the prototypical case of a accidental murderer where the forest was neither party's domain. It didn't belong to the victim. It didn't belong to the accidental murderer. So the cases are not analogous. Does that make sense, Gavin?
Yeah,
so the forest belongs just as much to the victim as it does the murderer. In the Bryce's case of a victim who enters the carpenter's shop, however, the victim, even though he received permission to enter from the carpenter, has nonetheless entered the private domain of his fellow man, since the situation is not comparable to the case of the forest. The carpenter is not liable or subject to exile. So what it's saying is the underlying rationale of the forest prototype is that the Torah subjects the unintentional murderer to exile only where the onus on being careful was on him. Right? But, because look, in a forest, it's not the private domain of the murderer. So it's his obligation to avoid injuring anybody, because there could be somebody there that is in the public domain. So the default position is he has to be aware before he chops wood in case there's somebody in there, because somebody else can enter that premises without him knowing. And therefore, it's not analogous to the case of somebody having his own domain. They're just two separate things. So that's the explanation of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina that just says you're not liable to exile. That's all he's saying. Right. So now Rava objects. I just need to cover a bit of ground. What were you going to say, Gav? We don't have much time.
No, I wasn't. Kevin.
I was. But if he's got signs on his door by the entry, risk of being injured or death. If he's got a sign there that people can see it before someone comes in to his private little factory or workshop.
No, so that's only in secular law. The reality is if it's a place where people are coming into, it should be cleared of hazards. You can't have a place that's dangerous and just say, listen, you got mangled. Did you read the sign, bud? It's not good enough. So let's just go on one quick sec. Rava objects. Rava says a kol v'chomer would actually dictate the opposite conclusion. Listen to this, very clever. If in the case of a forest where this one enters on his own and that one enters on his own, meaning the murderer and the victim, and they don't have to ask permission from each other, it's viewed as if the victim is one who enters with the permission of his fellow. In other words, the one wielding the axe and the murderer is subject to exile. Because in this case of the carpenter, where the victim is the one who enters with permission, is it not certain that the murderer is subject to exile? So what it's saying is as follows. Look, you're in a forest here. There might or might not be somebody that's around you. It's the onus is of you before you chop wood, since other people are entitled to be the forest, just like you are, because it's not your private domain, is you got to check these things out, Kevin. You can't start chopping wood in case there's somebody there. So if in a case where there could be somebody there and you accidentally kill them, you're liable to the city of exile for the rest of your life for that accidental murder. Surely in a case where you know somebody's there, it's not perhaps somebody's there, you know they're there because you gave them permission to come into your shop, you're carrying on working on lethal equipment that could possibly kill somebody, and you've given them permission to come there. Is it not certain in that case that you deserve to be exiled? If you exiled even in the case where there could be somebody in the forest, definitely in the case where you gave somebody permission to be in your premises when you carried on with something dangerous and you knew they were there, you weren't even, it wasn't even a case where you should be aware. For sure, then you should go to exile. That's what Rava's objection is. What do you mean it doesn't fit the case? Even more so, you should go into exile. Okay. Yeah. So, therefore, Rava explains it differently. So Rava said that's how Rava explains Rav Yossi Bar Chanina's explanation. Now, Rava's now got an issue with Rav Yossi Bar Chanina. He's not happy. Why? Because he said, what does Rav Yossi Bar Chanina mean when he says that the carpenter is not liable to exile? It means that exile is insufficient for him. In other words, his guilt is too great that exile should atone for it. Therefore, he's not exiled at all. And Rav Yossi Bar Chanina's reasoning is that the carpenter is an unintentional murderer bordering on the intentional. So what we're saying is, how Rava basically explains it is he says, in the case of the forest, you should have looked before you start chopping, because it's possible that somebody else could be in the forest with you, because the forest doesn't only belong to you. And therefore, you're very negligent, but that's not bordering on an unintentional murderer, bordering on the intentional. He said, here, the city of exile is too good for you. You don't deserve that sort of atonement, because the guy said, can I enter your shop? You said yes, and you allowed him to enter, and you carry on working on equipment that could lethally kill him. Then you're bordering on an intentional murderer. You don't deserve the atonement of being sent to the city of exile. If you're sent to the city of exile for failure just to even be aware that somebody's around you in an area where they could be, and that was gross negligence, in a case where you knew they were there, you gave them permission to be there, city of exile is too good for you. You don't even deserve that atonement. You're going to be in deep trouble in the next world. And obviously, there's not going to be the death penalty, because maybe there were no witnesses. It's just you and that possible customer. Do you understand the case of how Rava is explaining Rav Yossi Bar Chanina? Because the first explanation that the Gemara gave is they said, well, maybe it just doesn't fit the prototype, therefore they're saying the case is not analogous. Rava is saying no. It doesn't fit the prototype because you don't even deserve to have the benefit of exile. That's what Rav Yossi Bar Chanina is explaining. That's how Rava is explaining Rav Yossi Bar Chanina. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
All right, we've got a minute left. Any questions? All right, guys,
thank you.
Have a good Shabbos. I hope this made sense.
Shkach.
Yeah, no, it was clear. Thank you.
All right.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Have a good Shabbos. Enjoy.
Good Shabbos.